5'9", or about 175 centimeters tall, 175 grams of protein would be plenty for you. It's not a perfect system, but it'll get you in the right ballpark. And while there is some evidence to suggest that spacing your protein across 3 to 5 meals throughout the day might be more ideal, if that suggestion holds true, it's certainly much less important than simply hitting a daily protein target. In fact, contrary to common belief, training is a much more powerful contributor to muscle growth than diet, and by quite a long shot. So while it is true that a caloric surplus will drive muscle growth more effectively, and dietary manipulations like protein timing can have some impact, I'm going to focus the remaining levels on maximizing the muscle response through resistance training. So focusing on progressive overload is smart, but it still leaves a lot to be desired in the gym. For example, it doesn't tell us how hard we should push it, or how many sets we should do, or how many reps we should do, or how heavy we should be lifting. So next I want to take a quick look at what the research says about the so-called acute training variables, factors like effort, volume, intensity, exercise selection, and frequency. Now, I think effort is the most fundamental variable for growth because no matter how much you optimize all the other stuff, if you aren't pushing it hard enough, the muscle simply won't grow, at least not optimally. Now, there's currently a raging debate within the scientific community about exactly how hard we should push each set. A relatively small group of experts insist that all sets should be taken all the way to muscular failure, defined as an inability to complete another rep despite maximum effort. But I'd say that the mainstream scientific consensus is that it isn't necessary to take sets all the way to failure, but you do need to be pretty close. You shouldn't be leaving more than 2 or 3 reps in the tank for most of your sets. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions where leaving 5 or more reps in the tank does make sense for recovery, especially when training primarily for strength. But as a general rule, most of your sets should be pretty close to failure, so you do need to push it hard, maybe harder than you think. Up next, volume technically refers to the amount of work you do, and this was historically calculated as the number of sets times the number of reps times the amount of load. But as of 2015, most practitioners began to think of volume simply as the number of hard sets you do. Now, over the last few years, it's become a popular meme to think of volume as the, quote, primary driver of hypertrophy. And if I ever said this, I no longer think it's the case. Rather than more volume leading to more growth, what we instead see is a sort of inverted U-trend, where more volume leads to more growth only up to a point, past which further increases don't do anything extra, and then at a certain point, adding more volume seems to be counterproductive. So there's this volume sweet spot, which seems to be a bit different for everyone. And I find a lot of people are already doing more volume than they really need, and would probably benefit more by reducing their volume and focusing more on effort and execution. But the main point is that you should experiment and figure out what dose of volume gives you the best balance of gains and recovery. Still, based on what we know from the current science, something around 10 to 20 sets per body part per week seems to be a good range for most people and most muscles. So for example, if you're running an upper-lower split that has you in the gym 4 days a week, your chest volume might look something like this, with 6 hard sets for your chest on Monday and 6 hard sets for your chest on Thursday, totaling 12 hard sets for the week. Okay, next we need to cover intensity, which despite its popular conflation with effort, technically refers to how heavy the weight is. You can either lift heavy weights for low reps or light weights for high reps. But what's the best for muscle growth? Well, it turns out that as long as you're taking sets sufficiently close to failure, you can maximize hypertrophy using high reps or low reps, or a combination of both. Research has shown that reps as low as 3 and reps as high as 30 all cause similar muscle growth. However, there does seem to be a limit to how light you can go. New data shows that when you lift weights lighter than 20% of your 1 rep max, you do see significantly less growth. But the average rep count subjects got with that load was 67 reps. Not a very practical way to train regardless. So the traditional 6 to 12 rep zone is kind of a myth in the sense that research shows you can go well outside that range and still grow fine as long as you're training close to muscular failure. Still, I think there is some value in that 6 to 12 range because once you start dipping down below 6 reps, you can risk unnecessary strain on your joints, and it can be practically more difficult to accumulate enough volume. And the more often you go above 12 reps, the more you risk just burning yourself out, as higher rep sets are harder to recover from. So for practical purposes, I suggest splitting it up like this, with the majority of your sets coming in that 6 to 12, or maybe 15 zone, while having smaller chunks dedicated to lower reps for continued strength progression and higher reps for stimulative variety. Now, I think exercise selection and execution is just as much an art as it is a science. Sure, I do tend to favor multi-joint compound movements like squats, presses, and rows in my own training because they give you more hypertrophic bang for your buck by activating large amounts of muscle mass while promoting more efficient total body strength gain. And while I definitely think mastering these basic compound movements is important, single joint isolation exercises certainly have their place, especially when it comes to targeting smaller muscles like the biceps, rear delts, side delts, and abs, which can be overpowered if you focus on compound lifts exclusively. Luckily, when it comes to muscle growth, there are no mandatory exercises. And so after mastering the basics, it's once again important to experiment with different movements and movement variations to figure out what works best for you and your body's mechanics. Now, when it comes to frequency, it seems like most people have flipped from thinking that you should only train each body part once a week on a split that looks something like this, otherwise you're going to overtrain and melt your muscle away, to these days, most people thinking that if you train on a bro split like this, you're never going to make any gains at all, because science? In reality, the latest research actually shows that frequency in and of itself likely plays a relatively minor role in muscle growth, and the latest studies show similar results between hitting a body part once a week and 3+ times per week. However, I still generally recommend hitting a muscle at least twice a week, and I do prefer splits like upper, lower, and full body over the traditional body part split because they typically allow for more volume per week and higher quality volumes per workout. Still, as long as you've got all the other variables in place, are recovering properly and being consistent over time, this is an area of programming that probably deserves less of the spotlight than it tends to get. And then there are other training variables like rest periods, lifting tempo, and advanced intensity techniques that make up a relatively smaller piece of the puzzle, and rather than go into detail on these, I'll just link a few videos on them down below. Okay, so with progressive overload and the main acute training variables in mind, at this point I'd like to get a bit more granular and take a closer look at what's actually driving muscle growth physiologically. So in 2010, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld published a landmark paper with over 500 citations that introduced the 3-factor model of muscle hypertrophy. This model proposed that there are 3 main things driving muscle growth: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Now, the very short version is that mechanical tension is a type of force that tries to stretch a muscle fiber. One way to visualize this is like a tug of war. As each side pulls, tension is generated in the rope. So you can think of it like not only are the people pulling on the rope, but the rope is also pulling back on the people. similar in the muscle, where tension is passively created when the muscle is stretched, and tension is actively created during contraction when actin molecules are pulled by myosin heads. And as of now, tension remains absolutely undisputed as the primary driver of hypertrophy within the scientific community at large. Next, muscle damage is basically exactly what it sounds like: physical damage to the muscle like microtears and other cellular disruptions. And you can observe this under a microscope, where you see that the normal pattern in muscle can be seriously disrupted after training. Now, some believe that this type of damage is at least partly responsible for the delayed onset muscle soreness that you can feel in the days following training, although the soreness phenomenon is no doubt caused by a number of factors and still isn't fully understood. Still, for years, many people have just assumed that getting sore should be the goal of training, since soreness comes from muscle damage, and muscle damage causes muscle growth. But the latest science shows that that first claim is questionable, and the second claim is most likely not true. Of course, the most common sense way to think about this is that running a marathon would cause tons of muscle damage, but wouldn't do anything good for muscle growth. In fact, a review paper from Wackeridge and colleagues pointed out that, if anything, damage in this context would seem to decrease muscle growth. And even in a weight training context, damage doesn't seem to be doing much good. The study from Damas and colleagues argued that damage doesn't even correlate with hypertrophy over the long run. As shown in the figure here, early on in a training program, you see a huge amount of damage. This could be why you get so sore when starting a new routine. And while there is an associated early spike in muscle protein synthesis, the vast majority of that synthesis is directed toward repairing damaged muscle tissue rather than building new muscle tissue from scratch. And it's only after that damage decreases that muscle protein synthesis is directed toward new muscle hypertrophy. And while folks playing devil's advocate could argue, well, studies show that eccentric training causes more muscle damage, and studies also show that eccentric training causes more muscle growth, I would simply respond that correlation doesn't imply causation, and it seems more likely to me that the extra growth that you see from eccentric overloading could simply be coming from the fact that you can simply overload the muscle more heavily during an eccentric contraction, causing more tension in the muscle. Now, I should say that if we're being really honest, we don't actually understand muscle damage all that well. Even the methods of simply measuring muscle damage have been contested by prominent researchers. So the bottom line is that any theory that uses muscle damage to explain muscle growth is speculative at best and unfeasible at worst. But what about metabolic stress? Well, metabolic stress refers to the accumulation of metabolites like lactate and hydrogen ions and the muscle hypoxia that often follows weight training, and it's often associated with the massive skin-tearing pumps that you get from high-rep workouts. So if muscle damage and its ensuing soreness is unlikely to be driving muscle growth, surely the pump and its associated metabolic stress must be doing something. I mean, even Arnold seemed to recognize this.
The greatest feeling you can get in the gym, or the most satisfying feeling you can get in the gym, is the pump. Your muscles get a really tight feeling, like your skin is going to explode any minute. You know, it's really tight. It's like somebody blowing air into your muscle. It just blows up, and it feels different. It feels fantastic.
And while the pump does feel good and certainly can make training more enjoyable, and perhaps even provide some feedback that you're actually hitting the muscle that you're trying to target, it most likely isn't driving hypertrophy, because there are just too many examples of where the relationship between metabolic stress and muscle growth breaks down. Shorter rest periods cause more metabolic stress, but significantly less muscle growth than longer rest periods. Note that there's a footnote in the description box about this. Partial range of motion causes more metabolic stress, but often less muscle growth than full range of motion. Training all the way to failure causes more metabolic stress, but at best results in equal muscle growth to stopping a few reps shy of failure. And blood flow restriction training causes tons of metabolic stress, but doesn't enhance hypertrophy on its own, and doesn't even work in conjunction with training unless the training methods are highly suboptimal. And even in this case, it still seems to point back to tension. When I spoke with one of the authors of this popular blood flow restriction study, he pointed out that any benefit seemed to be tension related.
Would you argue that the impact of BFR essentially leads back to just creating more tension in the muscle? Like, do you think it still goes back to tension?
Yeah, it's just BFR it's like cheating 20 reps extra in a sense. It's the same effect. It just happens earlier.
So consensus is converging on tension, and perhaps tension alone, as being the primary driver of muscle growth. And so it should be the primary goal of our training to maximize tension above anything else. So how do we do that? Well, the practical application is actually quite simple. We need to apply progressive tension increases to the muscle itself. This means we need to lift with good, consistent technique while using the acute training variables and progressive overload to push the level of intramuscular tension up over time. Also paying attention to things like the mind-muscle connection, at least on certain exercises, and eccentric control should also help, as those aspects of lifting have been shown to increase intramuscular tension. Okay, so we know that mechanical tension is the main thing driving muscle growth, but what happens next? How do we get from a mechanical stimulus like tension to a biochemical signal that commands the muscle to grow? Well, Dr. Tromlin explained this to me in terms of blocks of dominoes. He said that when one thing gets activated, it passes on the signal to the next thing, and so on. But if you're smart, you don't just build one chain of dominoes. You build out all these side chains so that they fall in a bunch of different directions. And it's the same thing with muscle growth. There isn't just one pathway with one outcome, but rather many different interconnected pathways with many different downstream effects. So with that in mind, let's start at the top. All right, so we lift a weight heavy enough that it creates active mechanical tension within the muscle. This is called the stimulus. The stimulus is sensed by mechanosensors, which sort of feel that the muscle is being pulled into tension and pass that signal on. Now, based on the latest research, it isn't perfectly clear exactly which molecules are doing this sensing, but the top candidates include costomeres, which are collections of proteins that sit in the muscle fiber membrane and are responsible for holding muscle fibers together and transferring force between muscle fibers during contraction. There's also titin, which, as a fun fact, is actually the largest protein we've ever discovered in humans, and because it runs parallel to the muscle fiber itself, could theoretically be responsible for sensing mechanical changes like stretching, but probably only at long muscle lengths. And then there's filaments, which bind to the famous actin proteins that slide during contraction, making them a really good candidate for sensing tension. And for the record, I read through the latest paper on all this sensing stuff from 2018, and I'll just say, this area of research is not well understood yet. To quote the authors directly, conclusively identifying major hypertrophy stimuli and their sensors is one of the big remaining questions in exercise physiology. Still, we can paint the rest of the picture with a broad brush for now. From the mechanosensors, a signal gets sent to a beast mode molecule called mTOR, which is a major regulator of cellular growth in general, not just in muscle tissue. It's also implicated in many cancers because of its responsibility in making tissues bigger. From there, mTOR goes to the nucleus and tells the DNA machinery to produce a messenger RNA strand, which you can think of as a set of blueprints for building new muscle. Those blueprints are sent to a ribosome, which is like a muscle protein building factory that manufactures a string of amino acids based on the blueprint from the mRNA in a process known as translation. And this step is what we're actually talking about when we say muscle protein synthesis. Now, through this translation process, many different proteins will be synthesized, some of which will be the big contractile proteins that make us more jacked, others will be more ribosomal proteins, or mTOR proteins themselves, so anabolic growth potential remains high in the future. Now, if this rate of synthesis exceeds the rate of breakdown, protein balance is said to be positive, and in that case, new contractile proteins are incorporated into muscle fibers, resulting in what's called myofibrillar hypertrophy, leading to increased muscle size overall. But all of that is really just one string of dominoes. There's also this other path that's triggered by amino acids in the protein we eat. In this case, amino acids are transported inside the cell, and the amino acid leucine also activates mTOR. Now, for the record, we seem to need about 3 grams of leucine to stimulate mTOR, which can be found in about 20 to 25 grams of high-quality protein, although some research has shown greater anabolic responses with higher protein doses. So it may be possible to crank mTOR activity higher with more leucine, but regardless, it's important to realize that the stimulative impact of leucine is much shorter than the stimulative impact of weight training. And so for maximum mTOR stimulation, you need both training and leucine, with leucine essentially complementing the stimulative effects of weightlifting. Then the other 8 essential amino acids, there's 9 in total when you include leucine, make their way to the ribosome, where they're used as the fundamental building blocks for creating new muscle. Now, another pathway that I'll briefly mention is that of testosterone. Now, even though modifying testosterone within the natural range plays a relatively minor role in muscle growth, when you inject high-dose testosterone, the hormone crosses the muscle cell membrane and either binds to an androgen receptor directly or is converted to DHT, which then binds to the androgen receptor, and then that complex enters the nucleus and tells the DNA to start cranking out more blueprints, turning up that muscle protein synthetic process even more. Now, if I were actually discussing muscle growth with an expert, there are a lot of other things I'd want to discuss. I'd want to at least mention sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So far, we've been focusing on myofibrillar hypertrophy, so the growth of actual contractile tissue, but there's some new solid evidence supporting so-called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is the growth of all the other stuff inside the muscle fiber, like glycogen, organelles, and other non-contractile proteins. Then I might speculate that higher rep and higher volume training might bias the muscle towards sarcoplasmic growth, but then the expert, depending on how open they are to guesswork, might shut that down for lacking evidence. I also definitely want to talk about myonuclear addition, the idea that all this muscle protein synthetic stuff still seems to be limited by the number of nuclei or command centers that you have in your muscle cells to begin with. And so, when satellite cells that surround the muscle cell like satellites donate their nuclei, that could theoretically allow the muscle cell to crank out more new muscle protein and build more muscle. But then the expert might push back that that theory is actually pretty speculative, and we can't even rightly assume that nuclei are in fact limiting factors for hypertrophy until we get more science in our hands. And then a curious bystander might ask, why does any of this matter anyway? What's the point of this level of research? Maybe the expert would respond by saying something like knowledge having value for its own sake. Or maybe they'd point out a few of its many medical applications, such as in understanding sarcopenia or muscular dystrophy. Or maybe they'd say that they're trying to figure all this stuff out just in case there's a new pathway that can actually feed back into training recommendations. Or maybe we'll be able to use this research to develop an exercise pill someday that creates the same cellular effect as weight training without having to spend nearly as much time in the gym. A sort of steroid without side effects that could start development 50 years down the road. But since I'm getting well over my own head at this point, I think I'm gonna leave it there for this one. If you guys made it this far, please let me know by commenting I'm ready for level 6, and I'll see if I can make that happen in another video as new research comes in. As always, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys all here in the next one.
Hey, I'm John Cena, HBO's Peacemaker, and these are some moments from my life. This is an action shot from a WWE event, WrestleMania. When I see images, I kind of go back to how I felt. Right now, I'm probably feeling exhausted and satisfied because I know we're almost done with our performance, and it's going pretty good, or at least I think it is. I always judge by like the faces of the audience as you look at the front row, and certainly as we go back, engagement and interest, especially in our referee Mike Chioda's face. It's good to see a photo like that at such an impactful event and know that your audience was engaged, because as a live performer, what we do is for the benefit of the audience. So when I see that shot, the first thing I look at is the audience, and it's good to see them engaged. I'd like to know what's going through the mind of Dwayne Johnson. No, I wouldn't like to know what's going through the mind of Dwayne Johnson because he doesn't look pleased. So this is me in a different uniform, and this is me in a different uniform. And long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there was no Peacemaker uniform, and I dressed and acted like many of the other WWE performers until I got a chance to do this. Now, this is a bit of a confusing photo because it looks like I'm talking about something serious while dressed probably not as serious as the subject matter I'm talking. Kind of like right now. Like, will years from now, when I look back on this moment, be like, man, I was talking about deep philosophical things, dressed as a man who will kill to get peace. Time will tell. But as I reflect back on this is probably because I'm still wearing sports jerseys and a master lock around my neck. This is probably at the start of me defining myself as the hip-hop presence in World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE. Certain images spark emotions, and this one, man, I feel joy, a whole lot of joy. This was a celebration that the Make-A-Wish Foundation put together supposedly for me to let the world know that I just granted a 500th wish. But what I remember about this celebration is we got to grant a bunch more wishes that day. It was before a WWE event, and we got to bring in a bunch of Make-A-Wish families to a place where we could all eat and have fun and play games, and then we had a WWE event that night. It was like a wish on top of a wish, or just an added piece of depth to the day, and in an amazing gesture, WWE donated $1 million to the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and WWE and Make-A-Wish have been in a partnership now for almost 40 years, I believe. I've been able to share a piece of that partnership for almost 20 of those 40, and we've had some great moments, and my involvement with Make-A-Wish doesn't happen without WWE. And me being at the end of the wish, me being able to see the joy and the happiness that these families and children have when they get their wish granted, man, it is really pure joy. You can't have a bad day when you're involved with something like this, and this day certainly was no different. It's a wonderful day in my life, and it's a chance, the WWE donated resources to Make-A-Wish to make more wishes. That was the day we made more wishes, and that evening I got to perform for every single family there, and that was really special. Here, you're lucky enough to be invited into the home of Christopher Smith. That's right. This is where Peacemaker lives. Looks like he's had a rough day because he's covered in dirt and blood and shit and who else knows what. That is the brainchild behind Peacemaker, James Gunn. And that is him telling me that I'm not any good, and that I'll never work in this town again, and that I should move from here, the world in which people understand stuff, to over here, a place where I belong, where no one understands me because I'm not any good. James used a lot of talking with his hands when telling me I sucked because of the mask. You couldn't read his entire face. I know true emotion starts with the eyes, and he stared daggers through me for most of the production. But he also accentuated his point with his hands. Most of the time, he simply needed 2 fingers to let me know, his thoughts of my performance. This was a bonding moment between the two of us. As you can see me, I'm looking concerned of like, I'm not working this town again. What do you, spare me the medical terms, pal. Like, tell me, give it to me straight. So he did, and we continued to film for 120 days after that.
I get it, we all want to look stylish, but sometimes in the pursuit of personal style, we cross a few lines and end up doing the actual opposite and not looking that good. So in today's video, I have 5 mistakes that you're probably making while trying to look stylish. And by the way, if you're new here, hi, my name is Alex. This is my channel. We love to talk about men's fashion, grooming, hair, dating, and so much more. Literally, it's my job to help you live a better life, to make sure that you look your absolute best every single day. If that sounds good to you, then hit that subscribe button below, join us here on the channel, and of course, if you enjoyed today's video, smash that like button. The first style mistake that you're probably making, and I see this all the time, literally all the time here in LA, every single day, is wearing too many logos. Look, I get it, man. You got the designer, tracksuit, you got the designer shirt or the shoes. It looks cool on its own. Don't try to put logos with logos and monograms with monograms. It's just too much. It just looks way too busy. Worst of it all, it looks like you're trying too hard. It looks like you're trying to flex, and that is never a good look. It looks forced. The cool thing about style is that it has to be cool. It needs to look like it's more effortless, right? Unless you're going to a gala or something like that and everyone is going above and beyond and being extra for their looks. But if you're just walking around, having a good time, going to run errands, going to see friends, you cannot look like you're trying too hard because it comes off wrong. And when you wear too many logos, you're a walking billboard for these brands. It's just not a good look. It's not very stylish, especially if you're rocking the designer brands, because it literally looks like you're just trying to flex how much you paid for those items. So wearing too many logos is a no-no. Number 2, and it's funny because this would not be in this list if it was 2017 or so, but it's not 2017. So if you're wearing skin-tight jeans right now, my man, you are doing it wrong. Skin-tight jeans were hot for a second, and I literally mean like a second. It was like a very short window of maybe a year, not even 2 years, that they were popping, and then all of a sudden it completely changed. And when I say skin-tight jeans, I mean skin-tight jeans. I'm not talking about